Now let me move to a separate issue, which is a new book that has been published or is about to be published by Mike Pompeo, who was the former director of the CIA for President Donald Trump. He was also the Secretary of State for Donald Trump. He's somebody who I've tried to tell people who are in the MAGA movement for many years is not at all an adherent to MAGA ideology as it's been articulated by Trump or his supporters. He is quite the contrary, a pure establishment Republican. His voting record in the House before joining the Trump administration was pure neoconservative. He supports every war as well. He's the one responsible for Julian Assange being prosecuted. But he has a new book out because he wants to run for president. And in this book, among the things he did, if you bring up the headline from the NBC News story today, quote, Mike Pompeo criticizes journalist Jamal Khashoggi as a, quote, activist who received too much media sympathy. Now, I'm about to show you what Pompeo said in his book about Jamal Khashoggi that caused so much anger. I don't share this anger. I want to use this episode to illustrate what I consider to be a far more important question. So here's from the article. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sharply criticizes murdered Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in his new book, questioning his journalism credentials and lambasting what he calls the media's sympathetic coverage of his brutal killing at the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey. Quote, he didn't deserve to die, but, I find that an amazing sentence. He didn't deserve to die, but we need to be clear about who he was, and too many in the media were not, Pompeo wrote in, quote, never give an inch, fighting for the America I love. NBC News obtained a copy of the book in advance of its January 24th release. Pompeo, a potential 2024 presidential candidate, mocked the media's portrayal of Khashoggi as a, quote, Saudi Arabian Bob Woodward, who was martyred for bravely criticizing the Saudi royal family through his opinion articles in the Washington Post. Pompeo, who also served as CIA director in the Trump administration, described Khashoggi as a, quote, activist, claiming that he was a journalist only, quote, to the extent that I and many other public figures are journalists. We sometimes get our writing published, but we also do other things. Now, in other words, what Mike Pompeo was saying was that the media depicted Jamal Khashoggi as a journalist. That's the reason that Mike Pompeo was saying the media was so upset at the Saudi murder of Khashoggi because, oh, he's one of us. He worked for the Washington Post. He's a journalist. Therefore, we empathize. The Saudis have been murdering dissidents and critics and everyone else they feel like murdering for decades, while the U.S., every president from both parties supports them. It only suddenly became immoral when Donald Trump also embraced the Saudis, and they turned the Jamal Khashoggi case into this particularly unique moral atrocity, even though the Saudis have been doing this for decades, because in part they wanted to suggest that Trump had done something uniquely immoral by continuing to support the Saudis, notwithstanding this gruesome crime, but also because the U.S. media did have extra empathy for Jamal Khashoggi because he wasn't just a regular person. He was one of them. He was a journalist. And Mike Pompeo was questioning that. Was he really a journalist? He actually had a lot of activist goals in that region. And yes, it's true he wrote articles in the Washington Post, but according to Mike Pompeo, that doesn't make him a journalist. Now, most people in the media were outraged that anyone would say such a thing about Jamal Khashoggi. And among the people who were extremely angry about this were the Morning Joe crew, including Joe Scarborough and particularly his wife, Mika Brzezinski. Let's show how they reacted to this passage from Mike Pompeo's book.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is sharply criticizing murdered Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in his new book, questioning his journalism credentials and the media's coverage of his brutal killing in Saudi Arabia. NBC News obtained a copy of the book entitled Never Give an Inch, Fighting for the America I Love. In it, Pompeo writes about Khashoggi, saying, quote, he didn't deserve to die.
Questioning his journalism credentials, she said. Now, this is the point I actually want to raise from all of this. I don't really care about people criticizing Jamal Khashoggi. Even though he's become a martyr, he was actually a human being, a very controversial one at that, in that region and inside the United States. And while obviously it's barbaric and savage for the Saudi regime to have murdered him and chopped him up into a bunch of different pieces and then brought him back to Saudi Arabia in a suitcase that is not aberrational for the Saudi regime, that has been a close ally of the United States. One of the reasons why I don't take seriously the rhetoric that we're fighting in Ukraine to protect democracy, given who our closest allies actually are. But what I find interesting, as always, is this crucial question of who is and is not a journalist. That's really at the heart of this episode here. What Mika Brzezinski is so upset by is the idea that Mike Pompeo would suggest that Jamal Khashoggi is not really a journalist. Why does that matter? Why does that question matter? It gets discussed so often. If you mention the atrocity of keeping Julian Assange in prison for 4 years plus in a maximum security prison, and almost a decade before that, trapped in an embassy, the Ecuadorian embassy in London, so many liberal defenders of his persecution will say, I support this because Julian Assange isn't a journalist. Why does that matter? Why is that a relevant question? Who isn't, is not a journalist? And where does that get determined? You can talk about, for example, who is a cardiologist. A cardiologist is somebody who went to accredited schools, studied medicine and then the heart, and received a credential, a license from the state to practice cardiology. That's how we know who a cardiologist is. Or you can go to the school and become a psychologist, and then you get to become a licensed psychologist, and people then refer to you as a psychologist. There's no licensing for journalists. You don't get a license to practice journalism. You don't need a license to practice journalism. I never went to journalism school. I didn't graduate with a degree in journalism, like it's true for so many other people who practice journalism. And yet, on my shelf is every major award in the West for journalism. So I appear to have done okay, despite not having a license or a degree that says Glenn Greenwald, journalist. But this is an idea that is very new. This idea that only journalists practice journalism, and that people like Jamal Khashoggi aren't journalists because they actually have other goals. This is one of the really sinister things that corporate media has done. This is a new idea that comes from the 1950s, where we now talk about journalists as this special class of people, this special priesthood, and only they and they alone are the ones who are able to claim the protections of the First Amendment. So we have a list of rights in the First Amendment, the right of free speech, everyone gets to claim that, the right of the free exercise of religion, everyone gets to claim that. There are other rights, the right of due process, the right of a fair trial, everyone gets to claim those rights, but there's one right, the right of a free press, that's not available to all citizens, but available only to this tiny special priesthood, this credentialed class called journalists. That's the special class of people. And so it's crucial to debate who is and is not a journalist, because that's how you know who gets these protections. So Mike Pompeo wants to say it's not really that bad what the Saudis did because Jamal Khashoggi wasn't a real journalist, and Mika Brzezinski is horrified because she sees that as a way of somehow mitigating the evil of the murder, because he's trying to say it's not that bad because the Saudis only murdered an ordinary human being and not a journalist. When in fact what made that crime so uniquely evil was that it was a journalist who was murdered. And that's the argument that is made to justify Julian Assange's imprisonment. We're not imprisoning a journalist, we're just imprisoning some ordinary citizen. He doesn't deserve that label. And as I've recounted before on the show, when I broke the Snowden story, the first thing the New York Times did was try to read me out of being called a journalist. The headline of the article that was the first profile they did of me right after I broke the first story was anti-surveillance activist at the center of controversy, and then they changed it to anti-surveillance blogger. Everything but calling me a journalist. And this is a radical misconception that media corporations have tried to indoctrinate people to believing. It's very dangerous and very ahistorical and very wrong. There is no constitutional right in the Bill of Rights that is available only to a certain group of American citizens, called journalists or anything else. Every one of those Bill of Rights, the rights in the Bill of Rights, is available to all citizens equally. What is protected in the First Amendment is not a group of people called journalists. What is protected is the act of journalism, that any citizen, no matter what you call yourself, no matter what your job title is, no matter what you went to school for, is capable of doing. If you go and look how journalism was done, what they were actually trying to protect, the word journalist does not appear, you'll note, in the First Amendment. What appears is freedom of the press. And at the time, the press was the literal press. Citizens using the ability to copy documents to distribute them, like Benjamin Franklin did, like so many of the founding fathers did. It was the activity that was being protected. Thomas Paine, none of them consider themselves journalists. They consider themselves American citizens who were availing themselves of an activity called journalism, or using the press to agitate against the government. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.